Welcome, everyone, to today's MEERTalk. My name is Kathy Posey, your host for today. Today, we'll be hearing from Paul Gambill. Then we'll take questions from the MEER community. After that, we'll open it up for some questions from all of you in our audience. Now, let me introduce you to our guest speaker. Paul Gambill co-founded Nori, the first carbon removal marketplace, and served as CEO from 2017 to 2023. An early pioneer in carbon removal, he helped establish it as a distinct industry category and led Nori to sell the world's first soil carbon removal credits. After a decade building financial infrastructure for scaling carbon dioxide removal, Paul now writes at Inevitable and Obvious about the hard lessons learned in carbon removal and why cooling interventions are essential for buying time while carbon dioxide removal reaches the scale climate science demands. If anyone has questions that come up while Paul is presenting, please send them to co-host Lucinda in the chat. Okay, Paul, we are eager to hear what you have to say, so take it away, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for having me. It's nice to see everyone. Let me share my screen here and then. Okay. Thank you for having me. As Kathy said, I'm Paul Gamble, and I spent about a decade building one of the first carbon removal marketplaces. And I want to share with you what I learned from that period of time and then what I have been learning over the last year or so. So first, I want to start with something that might seem counterintuitive, especially coming from someone who spent years building carbon removal infrastructure. I think probably because you are self-selecting to be at this talk, most of you here will likely agree with this statement on screen that cooling the planet is not an alternative to solving climate change. But I think what's important to add is that I believe cooling the planet is actually now how we preserve the ability to solve climate change at all. And I recognize that that is somewhat of a big claim. So I just want to walk you through how I got here to this point, because this wasn't always what I believed, and I had to change my mind about some things. So back in 2015, I started working on carbon removal. And back then, we didn't even have that term, carbon removal. We called it carbon capture. And I founded what I believe is the world's first meetup group for carbon removal. And we would meet periodically, and we had to hunt for any papers or books that we could find about carbon removal. And it was clear to me at the time that CDR, carbon dioxide removal, was really the only way to lower the global temperature because there was already too much warming locked in. And back then, I ambitiously believed that by 2025, or now in 2026, that we would be removing at least 1 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere every year. That was ambitious, but it seemed achievable to me given technological scaling, economies of scale, and I was saying as much in my pitches to investors. I also thought and still think that the IPCC's goal of being able to remove 10 billion tons per year by 2050 was too conservative. I was telling people we needed 60 billion because we need to be able to account for any new emissions that are being created, and we really need to aggressively start paying down our carbon debt. I was a true believer in this. So I founded a company called Nori in 2017. And like Kathy said from my bio, we built one of the first carbon removal marketplaces. So I spent 7 years building this. We built infrastructure. We were educating the market on what carbon removal even was, raised a lot of money for this, hired a team. We worked with farmers and scientists around the US, and we accounted for hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 removed and sequestered. But early last year, the math really stopped working for me. So this is a chart from a report that was published by the Rocky Mountain Institute in early last year. And it was in a larger report on what it would take to scale up greenhouse gas removal. And it shows here a hypothetical scaling curve that would need to happen in order to reach that IPCC goal of 10 billion tons of removal capability by 2050. And now this is their optimistic scenario. This is the an S curve that has to happen in order for CDR to be this like meaningful climate solution. It's important to note that in the report they talked about how get reaching this scale in only 25 years would be more than twice as fast as any other industrial scale up that we have ever done when you're talking about like moving actual atoms around. So comparing it to like a steel industry or something like that. So this is aggressive and also the most optimistic scenario. And I want to draw your attention to this first milestone that they've marked at 2030. So, in order to stay on that curve, we would need to be removing almost 300 million tons per year by 2030. And that's only 4 years away from right now. So let's go take a look at a different chart. This is from CDR.FYI. They're the sort of premier tracker of carbon removal purchases and deliveries. And that's the web address, CDR.FYI. So they're tracking these deliveries globally. And what you're looking at here is the latest number on the total amount of carbon removal deliveries that have ever been delivered, and it's 1.2 million tons. That's cumulative. That's not per year. That is total over the lifetime of the market and the industry. And this is nowhere near the right order of magnitude for reaching that scale up. I will point out, though, this does not include more nature-based types of removals, like through soil or forestry or something. This is about permanent durable tons, which is a distinction that is a much deeper discussion here. But the point is that we are far off. The CDR industry has effectively had almost zero impact on the atmosphere to date. So let's go back to this curve. And I want you to now look at the area under the curve here. So this is the part that really kind of broke my brain earlier this year when I was looking more closely at this. So even if we hit that target, if we're able to scale up and we're able to reach 10 billion tons of removal capability by 2050, even in this most optimistic scenario, the area under the curve represents how much we would have cumulatively removed between now and then. And that removal is only about 100 billion tons, which is equivalent to only about 2 or 3 years worth of emissions. So it's nowhere near enough. So all of that work, getting to that scale, is not going to do anything to affect global temperature because it's equivalent to just turning emissions off for 2 to 3 years and then turning them right back on. And meanwhile, obviously, the problem is that global emissions have not peaked yet. So every year is still tied for roughly the highest emissions in human history. And I just don't see any path to this rapidly changing. I mean, you can even look at the current state of geopolitics. Like the United States just launched a military action for oil. And it's not just the US. You have other countries around the world who have previously been much more committed to climate spending and decarbonization and energy transition, pulling back because of economic conditions and so on. So I don't see any miracle coming that is going to rapidly decarbonize in the way that some people might hope. So I just to be clear though, the I still very much believe in carbon removal. It's the permanent solution to the whole thing. We're going to have to pull this CO2 back out. It's just not going to arrive in time. Uh, and I'll talk about what in time means. So I had to ask myself a different question. What happens in the gap if this permanent solution isn't going to arrive for decades or maybe even centuries? So that's what I've spent all of 2025 trying to understand better as I was pulling myself out of the CDR industry focus and looking at the bigger picture. And so what I found pointed me toward what we really need to be talking more about, which is tipping point risks and catastrophic climate change risks. And just recently in October, we had or November, we had Tipping Points researchers saying that they believe that we have passed the threshold for coral reef die-off. So this is the first major Earth system tipping point that is already behind us. But it's not just about Earth system tipping point. So what really keeps me up at night is that climate instability doesn't just threaten ice sheets and coral reefs. It degrades every single system that we are going to need in order to solve this problem. So in a world with increasing climate instability, insurance markets are going to become unviable in response to extreme weather like wildfires, extreme storms, and flooding. And without insurance markets, you don't have a global economy, which means supply chains are going to break down as well. And as heat increases, we're going to start to see food systems breaking down, which is going to lead to mass migration, which begets social unrest, which further entrenches the political extremism that we are already seeing. And every one of these makes the others worse. And as it leads to this feedback loop, our climate instability is going to reduce our capacity to actually act, which is going to make climate change harder to solve, which creates more instability. So this is the runaway feedback loop that I am most concerned about, and this is what we're on track for, even in the most optimistic carbon mitigation scenarios. So climate change itself is what is going to make climate change harder to solve. We're not just risking temperature rise, we're risking our entire capacity to act in the first place. And so that's why now I believe something that I would have thought was kind of crazy a few years ago. I I had always thought that geoengineering or sunlight reflection was something that was more like an insurance policy in case things got really bad, and it was something that maybe would happen in the latter half of the 21st century. But I don't see it that way anymore. What I believe now is that stabilizing the temperature through cooling interventions is not about being plan B. It is the necessary precondition for plan A to succeed in the first place. So I want to show you what I mean by this. This is where we are right now, here on the left. We've got temperatures increasing, our systems are starting to become stressed, our capacity is declining across all different aspects of society, and we've got some tipping points already passed and some coming quite near. And where we want to get is to a sustainable future with a stable climate. We've decarbonized our economy. We've removed massive amounts of legacy CO2 from the atmosphere. But this gap in between is where the really dangerous bit lives. It's where tipping points are going to hit, where systems are going to start failing, and we're going to lose our ability to act. So my proposed framework here is to think about this in terms of stabilization. Stabilization is the bridge that's going to get us across from where we are now to where we need to get. And that means that cooling interventions that hold down temperatures while the permanent solutions are scaling up. But when I say stabilization, I want to be clear that I don't mean just one thing. I actually mean a portfolio of interventions because it's not just about temperature. It's also all of the tools that we are going to need in order to hold the line while the permanent solutions scale. So, of course, this starts with cooling, with sunlight reflection, increasing surface albedo, acknowledging existing albedo loss and what we're going to do about that. But we also need to be doing a variety of other things, like protecting ice sheets from melting and collapsing and causing massive sea level rise. It means doing everything we can to avoid irreversible tipping points like AMOC collapse or permafrost melt, releasing methane and causing more runaway feedback loops. It also means local and regional cooling and taking actions to break up large storms before they wreck cities and cropland or breaking heat domes, or the type of work that MEER is doing to help deal with the fact that it's already too hot. And lastly, it means ensuring that our future livelihoods that depend on these important ecosystems are protected. So, what does a stabilization framework, as I'm calling it, actually buy us? First is time. It's the time needed to scale decarbonization to net zero and then removing the over 1.5 trillion tons of legacy excess CO2. We're running out of it. We need more time. Second is capacity. That means maintaining functional insurance markets and an economy that is able to move resources around for both continuing human civilization, but also for the work of solving climate change itself. Third is social willpower. So We need to put a lot of attention into avoiding overwhelming the public so that we can still plan for the future and not be reactive to every social ill that's going to come from a warming world. We're already experiencing this. And finally, are the tools themselves, because if we allow temperatures to increase much further, we are going to see our natural carbon sinks degrade and even flip into carbon sources. And we need every possible major sink there is, and we have to protect them while we can. So, without stabilization, we lose the ability to implement the permanent solution in the first place. Carbon removal in a 3-degree world with collapsed supply chains and political chaos is just not going to happen. It's not going to be prioritized. And I want to look back now at how this has evolved over time. So, throughout every decade since effectively 1988, when Jim Hansen's testimony to the US Senate first kicked off global awareness around warming risks, we've added tools to the climate response, but it's only been after much complaint from the crowd that believes that mitigation only is the right response. And by the way, to brief aside, the word mitigation is so silly of a word that we've ended up with this word because it was originally meant to mean reducing emissions so that we mitigate the effects of a warming world. And so now mitigation has come to mean decarbonization, but it's effectively decarbonization. But then in the 2000s, it became unavoidable to admit that adaptation was going to be necessary. People saw it as if you say that adaptation is going to be necessary, then you're like giving up the fight on reducing emissions. And so, how dare you do that? You're just you're giving up. But eventually, people started to realize, well, this stuff is happening anyway. We're going to have to adapt. And then I personally lived through the transformation in the 2010s when carbon removal went from being a moral hazard that scientists wouldn't even research to an industry with billions of dollars invested. And it was the same argument too, that if you develop novel ways of pulling atmospheric CO2 out of the air, then you're just going to give a free pass to all of the emitters. And the argument we were making back then in like 2015 to 2017 or so was it doesn't matter. It's too late. There is already too much CO2 in the air, and we have to develop this capacity in order to do it. So I believe now that the 2020s when stabilization is going to enter this toolkit. And that means the cooling interventions and albedo modification and all of the other portfolio pieces I mentioned a few slides ago, because this is the moment that we're in and what we're all working on. And I view it as unavoidable. Like this is just the sad reality of the climate math and where we are, that we are going to have to take these steps. So I still believe that decarbonization and carbon removal are the permanent solutions that has not changed, but we have to be able to get there. And that requires functioning societies, stable systems, and time that we do not currently have. And the future of this is not written yet, but the window to shape it is narrowing. We are running out of time. And there are decisions that we as a society have to make in the next 5 to 10 years that are going to affect this and the following centuries. We have to find a way to bridge this gap. And my proposal to you all and to others is that our most important priority right now is focusing on stabilizing conditions in order to make it possible to succeed in solving climate change. And I will wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. We really appreciate your presentation and laying this out so clearly. I would like to welcome our first on-camera questioner, someone from our MEER community, Robert Tulip. Robert Tulip lives in Australia. He has worked for 3 decades for the Australian Agency for International Development, mainly with Australia's aid program to Papua New Guinea. He has been working on scalable climate solutions since 2007 and is on the steering circle for the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. He is writing a book on the proposal for an albedo accord. He has a master's degree in existential ethics. He chairs the Asia Pacific Region Standing Committee for the World Student Christian Federation and manages the multi-faith chaplaincy at the Australian National University. Robert, thank you for joining us so extremely early on your Friday morning.
It's wonderful to be here, and thank you, Mia, for hosting Paul and this really essential conversation. I've shared something of a similar path to Paul, going through the whole question of scalable carbon removals as a primary strategy, and gradually shifting over the years to a recognition of direct climate cooling and more specifically albedo restoration as the key emergency. I had some contact with Nori over the years, and
Oh, really?
Paul's yeah,
I
well,
wasn't aware of that.
just well, with one of your colleagues here in Australia. I've forgotten his name. I've just been following the whole space, but not
Got it.
closely. Uh, but uh, as a startup, you'd be familiar with the concept of the Valley of Death,
Hmm.
and this problem of getting funds between being small and being big, and
Yep.
your implementation gap, that bridge that you showed us, reminded me of that Valley of Death concept
Hmm.
in startups. But what I I think that one thing that we share is a an attempt to have a deeply rational approach to public policy, to say what is the practical, pragmatic uh, approach that we can take to stabilise the climate as a precondition for a stable economy and society. And one of the things that really distresses me about the public climate debate, the argument about net zero by 2050 delivered
Hmm.
by decarbonisation, it's
Yeah.
if we have uh, a world temperature at 3 or possibly 4 degrees above um, uh, uh, the Holocene norm, then that is so deeply unstable. It like the risks that are associated of unknown tipping points. It's just the prospect of having 8 billion people on our planet without any action to restore the lost albedo.
Yeah.
So we've lost about 2% of albedo already this century. It really is quite a crisis, but it doesn't uh, register with the public debate. It's a
Yeah.
very strange
Yeah.
situation that we face, and so I'm interested in your theme that you've raised about how to shift the Overton window,
Hmm.
so that an understanding of the value of cooling becomes a part of the public conversation. And so a challenge, Paul, that I think really needs to be explored more is the understanding the constituencies of support for cooling,
Yeah.
and recognizing that there are uh, significant there's significant opposition to cooling on
Hmm.
moral hazard grounds. For example, this argument that if we cool the earth, then it will destroy the rationale for subsidies for renewable energy. Uh, that's one sort of cynical way of putting it, but
Hmm.
uh, there's this broad idea that you know we must prevent anything that removes the focus on decarbonisation alone as the climate strategy. And
Yeah.
yet, when you look at, you mentioned the insurance problem, and as insurance market collapse and
Hmm.
supply chain breaks and food system breakdowns as key um, risks that are emerging from heat. And so that means that the industries who uh, depend on those
Yeah.
uh, things are key constituencies of support. And
Right.
so insurance, banking, agriculture, tourism, other industries have a direct commercial interest in retaining a stable climate.
Right.
And and one of the problems that we've had with the debate is that the argument for the need for stable temperature just hasn't really been funded in uh, in mass
Yeah.
media.
Hmm.
And my sense is that the only way that's going to happen is if the big commercial industries who have a direct interest in sustainable climate uh, can be convinced they are the ones who have the capacity to shift the Overton window. Like you and I have no ability to speak to the general public. Like we don't get uh, uh, well.
Somewhat.
Yeah, somewhat. Sorry, you probably more than me, but just being able to get op-eds into major newspapers, it was so interesting to see the opinion piece by Daniel Vigioni and his colleague just published this week in the Guardian,
Hmm.
just saying that we really do need to change the conversation and recognise the importance of a discussion about geoengineering, but still not advocating for deployment. And this is where I think there's the to say that we might be able to get away with not cooling the earth. To me, that's insane in a way because
I agree.
without a cooler earth, um, all of these fundamental industries that are essential to human stability and prosperity will face just such major barriers. I'll just check if there was. Um, so you commented that if in an email discussion that we had that
Hmm.
if trying to raise money for continued research, you have to stay within the window of what funders will grant money to.
That's right.
But I'd like to ask: is it possible to uh, to try to move that window by identifying different funders who will support the cooling of the earth, and so uh,
Yeah.
change the conversation?
Sure. So this is actually what I've been working on as a personal project lately is recognizing that as an ecosystem, the field of organizations that are working in the cooling space is very small. There are not that many. They're not that well funded, and it is, given the scope of the problem, it is sort of ludicrous. Like if you were an alien observing what is going on the planet, you would wonder what the hell we're doing because it's totally out of whack relative to what we actually need to be doing.
And
Um,
don't look up is an example of that.
sure, yeah, yeah. But the like the way that capital moves around in both the for-profit and the nonprofit sectors is there's funders are herd animals. They are very often focused on risk mitigation, and they are averse to funding or investing in things that don't have a potential path for gaining further funding. Like if you're a startup investor, you only want to invest in a company that you think is going to be successful enough to raise the next round of funding, which is going to be from some other fund that's bigger than you. And similarly, in the nonprofit world, if you are a philanthropic foundation that's focused on this kind of work, it is somewhat similar in that because you are funding organizations that are working on large scale problems, and if you're looking at like their budgets are in the millions of dollars, sort of thing. So you only want to fund something that you think has a chance of like making impact and making impact in a way where it's going to continue to pull in more funding like that. So today, the current situation is there are maybe like five or six different foundations that have funded all of the different organizations that are doing the work at the big scale. So you talked about that op-ed that Dakota and Daniele published, like Reflective is an organization like that. I would also include like Degrees Initiative or um, the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering or some of these others. Like their funding sources, if you go look at their funding pages, they're all getting funded by the same foundations. And those groups are true believers in this. But if you want to move to like the next scale, so in startup language, we would call that if you were going from like a seed round to a Series A to a Series B round, you need to be looking at bigger funds. And in the nonprofit world, that means like bigger foundations that are interested in funding work around climate change and environmental stuff. When it comes to like trying to get funding from those types of groups, I've talked to them and I've heard this feedback from both the leaders of these nonprofit organizations and the existing foundations that are funding them, saying like the feedback that they get is, look, this is too radical. This is too out there. It's too politically risky for us to take a position on, dangerous geoengineering. And that's the real, I think, barrier to scaling these small groups right now. So my approach has been thinking about this from an ecosystem perspective. What can we do? What is the like highest leverage action in order to expand the ecosystem, bring more capital in, and increase the amount of impact that their work is able to have? And that means moving this Overton window so that it becomes socially acceptable for the bigger foundations to put more philanthropic capital into the space. My proposed approach for doing this is a essentially a targeted campaign that is trying to make this understandable and relatable. And first, I'm drawing upon lessons that I learned while doing this in the carbon removal space, which I alluded to in my presentation, where um, in 2015 when I first started working in the CDR space. And by the way, like I have no background in earth sciences. My background is computer engineering and management and like software development stuff. So in 2015, it just kind of seemed to me like, hey, this is obvious. Like, why aren't we working on carbon removal? And I started investigating and found there were a handful of research labs. There were a few different startups working on direct air capture, but that was basically it. And it was because of the moral hazard argument. Like, people would get censored for wanting to even work in research in this space. And I thought that that was silly because if you just looked at the math, like even if you turned off all sources of emissions, like if mitigation was 100% successful tomorrow, there's still far too much CO2 in the air. So of course we're going to have to pull it back out. So my response to the moral hazard argument was like, yes, that's a real risk, and we have seen that play out. Don't get me wrong, but we still have to do this anyway, and we just have to manage that risk. And that was largely successful in doing so because you can see now, while I was making all these claims about how the CDR industry has not actually had much atmospheric impact, there are over 700 different startups working at various different levels of the carbon removal space. There have been tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars invested into these startups. And there's a whole bunch of uh, going into the weeds about like how that's structured that I don't really want to do right now. But the industry is like the foundation for the industry is there. So we have been successful in like breaking that taboo against carbon removal. It's now widely accepted, and normal people on the street will often understand what I say if I say that I work in carbon removal. I think a similar approach can be taken here, but it starts with understanding the reality of the situation that we're in, which is why I was trying to show these charts at the beginning about how decarbonization and carbon removal are not going to happen in time. And we do have really huge catastrophic risks that are looming over us. So there is certainly an amount of like informational awareness, but the particular thing that matters is awareness by whom. So I don't think that this is necessarily like a need for a mass education program of the public, not yet at least. But there are going back to like the intelligentsia, essentially, where the Overton window for this is set. That's what needs to be changed. And so what I am endeavoring to do is continue to advance this stabilization framework, and I want to take an approach that is essentially publishing like a stabilization plan. Like, what is the plan for the rest of the 21st century? What are the sequenced things that we need to be doing and preparing for? It needs to happen in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s, 60s, and so on. And doing so with targeted events private conversations, dinners, and things to make this more acceptable for the people with capital and access to power to start voicing that, because that's how you can change these sorts of movements. And then eventually, there are various things that might need to be done around like working with the public. But right now, the biggest barrier is unlocking the capital sources. So that's where my focus has been.
If I could just follow up, Paul, you've talked about the moral hazard argument that has been a major barrier to,
Yeah.
firstly, and to work on carbon dioxide removal, but now on solar geoengineering. And it seems to me that one of the key things about the moral hazard argument is it's about political alliances.
Mhm.
This
Mhm.
sense that it's morally wrong to support the capitalist system in its broad
Yeah.
form, and
Yeah.
so whereas uh, the like I think one of the things that our political situation shows is that the capitalist system is very dominant. It's here to stay. It's got a lot more money than its opponents, and
Yeah.
power and influence. And so the
Mhm.
idea that you could achieve a climate policy in opposition to the capitalist system just seems to me very unrealistic. But then
Yep.
then becomes a question of uh, of what sort of a conversation uh, could be incrementally possible for industries like insurance, who are, deeply embedded within the capitalist system.
Mhm.
And one of the problems there is that, decarbonisation has become a bit of a toxic problem for them. That like we've
Sure.
seen Trump Farage reaction,
Mhm.
and there's been this incredible right wing backlash
Yep.
against net zero as a concept, and this is where I find the example of um, the Montreal Protocol uh, to remove ozone depleting substances
Mhm.
is really valuable, because it was able to work within the existing economy to prevent serious danger of the loss of the ozone layer. And so I think of an albedo accord as a similar way of targeting the albedo layer in in a narrow way, and saying if we can get that into the public conversation, even among people who are sceptical about the need for decarbonisation, then that's um, a useful path forward.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I personally find that compelling and interesting. I think that unfortunately, I don't want to do much finger pointing, but like, I mean, you mentioned the moral hazard stuff, and like in 2014 or 15, it was I think when Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, was published, and um, this notion of like, okay, in order to solve climate change, we have to overhaul the entire economic order, and how like, it, and then climate change will just kind of fall into place. Like, uh, it's one, it's ludicrous. It's not going to happen. And two, I'm an engineer and a project manager, and I think about things in terms of like what can you pragmatically accomplish. And we overcame that argument when it comes to carbon removal. Like the foundation for the industry is there now. And I think that the same thing can happen here with the right sorts of uh, um, interest group activations. You talk about like, more right-wing retrenchment around climate stuff, and I agree. And it also makes sense that people are responding to ESG was like the big bogeyman of like 2 or 3 years ago in financial markets, because it turns out that that's one, not actually producing good financial results, and it feels like this politically coded thing, and it is. And so I'm trying to direct more focus on like what is actually going on and what needs to actually happen, instead of these like the fig leaf stuff. And I do think that this approach that people have taken at like the COP and IPCC level around mitigation only is deeply frustrating. Um, I recall at the Global Tipping Points conference over the summer last year in the UK. Herb Simmons is here in the room, and he interviewed Johan Rockstrom on video, asking like they just spent like multiple days at this conference talking about these huge catastrophic risks, and yet he would say that anything around sunlight reflection is far too risky to consider. Like that doesn't make any sense. And so I think that that's an issue as well. But I think that right now, when you look at the community of people that are even aware of these issues and discussing it, it's very small in number. And it does not have to be the case that we have to convince everyone who works in climate science that sunlight reflection and cooling interventions are a necessary thing. I think it is more important to look at the levers of power and capital and convince those people. And because that's where you can actually move things and inform how this debate is structured over time. I think the IPCC and COP are essentially a failure at this point, and evolving parallel structures or trying to work for reform within all at the same time are all probably good efforts to take.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Robert. Before I welcome our next questioner, I would like to invite our audience members to please send questions in the chat to co-host Lucinda, and then she will share them with me and I'll share them with Paul in a little bit. But first, I would like to now welcome Robert Criss. Robert Criss holds a master's degree in environment science and society from University College London and a PhD from the Open University. His research focuses on systemic factors in global climate policy and complexity thinking in early geoengineering discourse. He is a visiting fellow at the Open University and an associate at the Center for Climate Repair, Cambridge. He is the author of Systems Thinking for Geoengineering Policy and has co-authored works with Sir David King and Dr. Sean Fitzgerald. Before academia, Robert was a UK chartered accountant with over 50 years experience. Thank you for joining us, Robert.
Thank you. Well, this is a very interesting session. I'm not going to say too much about myself other than just how I got into this with that background, because I went through most of my life having no interest in the environment at all. And then around the millennium, I read two books, and they were projecting from completely different narratives that by the end of this century, by the end of 2100, by 2100, that the global human population would be down to about 1 billion. Now, at that time, it was around 7 billion. And I thought to myself, that's an awful lot of people that are going to die prematurely. These guys are either crazy or they know something that I need to find out about. And the two guys involved, one of whom was James Lovelock, and another one was a guy you probably heard of, and the other was a guy called John Gray, who's a professor at LSE. Well, clearly not crazy. And so it was something I had to find out about. And so that started a journey, which a dozen years later ended up with me getting a PhD in this topic. And I went through a series of kind of interesting, it was an interesting journey finding out about geoengineering, because when I started my PhD, it was just after Paul Crutzen had issued his paper in 2006, suggesting precisely what we're talking about now, that we should be looking again at SAI, an idea, stratospheric aerosol injection, an idea that wasn't new. It was an idea that had already been discussed in the 1960s when Lyndon Johnson commissioned an inquiry into climate change. So this, there's nothing novel here. And at the time, as I was doing my studies, I thought to myself, well, this is a crazy idea. I mean, this is just lunatic. This is only going to ever happen when everything else has failed. And over the last 15 years or so, that's the journey that humanity has gone on. We are
Yep.
moving towards terminal failure on all of the other issues, and we
Mhm.
are boxing ourselves into a corner where some kind of solar radiation management is going to be our only escape route. So that's just kind of a little bit about my journey, and obviously mirrors to some degree your own, Paul, in your recent growing awareness since Nori. But it's essentially, I've got two questions. One is about the role of the market here, and Robbie Tulip, who he and I are cross swords routinely and have quite opposing views on a lot of issues. Um, I don't want to hear anything more about moral hazard because it just drives me crazy.
Hmm.
That's a whole separate topic, but that is just such a confounding, confusing, nonsensical uh, uh, issue
Yes, it is. Yeah.
that it deserves a treatment on its own, but not here. So global warming, I think we'd all agree, is a collective action problem requiring global management of the climate system. And I would stress the point global management. One of the things, if I could achieve anything with you, Paul, it would be to get you to stop talking about the solution to climate change. There ain't no solution to climate change. It's
Sure.
not a problem. It's not a problem that is amenable to a solution. Job done, let's move on to the next problem. Climate change is now something that we, humanity, will have to
Forever.
permanently manage.
Yes. Hmm.
And I think that that's an important thing that people understand, that
I agree.
we're not looking for solutions, we're looking for management, continuing management. So, and it's also a point that I think that's been made, it's a public good. And for those that are not familiar with what that term means, it's a very
Mhm.
specific economic term. And it means that the good of dealing with climate change, of bringing back, restoring the climate, is non-excludable and it's non-rival. And what that means is that if you do it, if it's done, nobody can be excluded from the benefits of it. And moreover, when it's done, one person's consumption of it or one person's enjoyment of it doesn't reduce what's left for anybody else.
Right.
And these two characteristics together basically mean that you can't have a market in public goods because there is no profit opportunity for providing goods of that nature.
Yep.
And yet, in essence, dealing with climate change is about delivering a public good. So public goods, and we in the email exchange we had yesterday,
Hmm.
there was a reference to uh, the defence, the national defence, the military, which
Hmm.
is another typical public good. So we don't need to talk about militias, private militias, but governments control their armies. They decide what the requirement is. They decide how much money to spend on it and how it's to be deployed. And then they engage in a contractual way with the private sector to go off and design this stuff and to build it. It'll be a kind of a collaborative effort between the two. But
Right.
ultimately, the government is driving the issue. They're in
Mhm.
control. And they are the customer. There is only one customer,
Right.
that is the government.
Yep.
And so one of the things that intrigues me here is about where markets, the role that markets
Mm.
play
Yeah.
in addressing climate change. And your particular experience with Nori here, I think, is going to be very interesting to understand and to pick at. So markets haven't done a great job so far, so evidently, because we're not making much progress by your own
Yeah.
acknowledgement. So why is it? Why is it that markets have been so poor? And what is it about? Is it about the learning curve because it's new stuff? It's just taking a long time to become entrenched, or is it more systemic? That being a public good, markets are always going to be
Yeah.
marginal unless
Yeah.
governments really pick this up, pick the ball up and run with it. So
Yeah.
I'd be really interested to understand more how you see markets, and this picks up on Robbie's previous comment about capitalism, because that's
Hmm.
essentially about markets. And we live in a time when this neoliberal moment when markets are supreme. How does all that kind of work for you?
Yeah. I think it's going back to the like mitigation, adaptation, carbon removal, stabilization framework. I think they all require a different answer to your question. I do think that markets have actually been pretty successful when it comes to mitigation. I mean, we've seen enormous progress on renewable energy transition, and well, I mean that's the main one. That in a way that like it would have seemed almost unimaginable 30 or 40 years ago. Um, but it's not fast enough. I fully agree. But we have seen that market forces are going in that direction. On adaptation, I think that that is potentially similar. I'll come back to that. Carbon removal, though, is a really interesting beast. So when I first entered the space in 2015, I thought that what would like I never believed that a focus on selling, which is what the industry has become, selling carbon removal credits to large enterprise companies, it's not scalable. Like even if you look at the total number of scope 1 and 2 emissions from all Fortune 500 companies, it's only like 2 billion tons per year. And I know that's a big number, but that's it's a fraction of what we are totally emitting. So even if all of those companies, which would include all of the oil majors and so on, if they were directing 100% of the necessary budget to paying to draw back down the carbon that they've emitted, it's not making a difference in the total atmospheric budget. So I always believed that this had to be a much more distributed and even decentralized sort of approach where carbon removal is integrated into every aspect of the economy, almost like a VAT sort of approach at different levels. And that was what we set out to build at Nori. And it was, I think, a little too ambitious for the time of where we were. But we had a whole blockchain and cryptocurrency model for how we were going to facilitate that. And we had this really elegant design. But unfortunately, the way that the industry works today is if you are a company that is trying to buy carbon removal, you have a sustainability director who is in charge of that. And maybe they've been empowered by the CEO, maybe not. And typically, most of their job is actually just reporting. And so it's reporting on what impacts the company is having. And if you're going to start doing something like trying to go purchase carbon removal credits, that's like on top of your existing full-time job. So it's a difficult thing to do. It requires putting together usually a custom offtake agreement, which can take anywhere from 3 to 12 months or even more in some cases, with a lot of diligence. And you only see the companies that have a lot of free cash flow pursuing this. So this primarily ends up being technology companies. The companies that have the most need for doing this don't have big enough margins, and so they don't invest in it. But what ends up happening is the buyers of these credits are most concerned with their reputational liability because there have been a lot of news stories covering some really fraudulent carbon offset projects. And to a layperson, there is no difference between like a REDD Plus forest preservation project and a highly vetted long-term durable carbon removal project. They just say, oh, these carbon projects are fraud and bad. So if you are a sustainability director at like an airline or something like that, your number one concern is making sure that what you're buying doesn't come back to bite you. And so that means that you're going to do a lot of risk mitigation. You're going to be looking for what are the most vetted projects out there. You're also going to be looking for what are the most durable projects. And durability and carbon removal refers to how long the CO2 remains sequestered. And I've written about this on my Substack. There's an article called Carbon Removal's Wrong Turn, if anyone wants to look it up, about the history of why this ended up happening this way. But the short version is in 2019, Stripe, the payment processing company, became the first company that said we were going to focus on carbon removal as opposed to carbon avoidance offsets. They said that they were willing to pay any price per ton for it, and they put together an advisory committee and then submitted an RFP uh, for companies to submit to. We at Nori submitted to it. Their advisory committees came back and said, look, if you're going to invest in carbon removal as an offset, the emissions that you are creating are coming from fossil fuels, which means that they are having a radiative forcing impact that will last 1,000 years or more. Therefore, if you are going to offset and claim offsetting, then you need to pay for carbon removal that will remain sequestered for at least 1,000 years or more. And that has pushed us more in the direction of the single most expensive carbon removal projects that are out there. They're not happening at any scale. We saw the chart with like 1 million tons delivered. So this is like direct air capture, enhanced rock weathering, biomass burial, that kind of thing. And I always was very frustrated with this because we have a carbon problem today, not just in 1,000 years. And if we are developing sequestration methods that are sufficiently reliable for 10 years, 50 years, or 100 years, that's good enough for right now, and we can deal with more of the problem later on. So the whole industry, I have lots of complaints. I've written a lot about it, but the whole industry has been set up in a way with these like weird incentive structures, and so that's why it's not scaling and why it hasn't gotten there. Now, when it comes to stabilization or geoengineering or that kind of thing, I think that it is, of course, going to be the case that there will have to be private companies that are involved in developing the hardware and technology for deployment. If we're talking about like an SAI deployment with a fleet of specialized planes that are able to inject the aerosols in the stratospheric level, like, yeah, obviously you're going to have to get probably defense contractors or someone else involved in doing that. Um, where I take issue is with the notion of intellectual property over this. So, for instance, like I kind of understand where Stardust is coming from. Stardust being the startup that just announced a $60 million funding round to develop this novel aerosol particle that they've developed, and we don't know any details about what it is for deployment. And they say, well, we'll only sell this to governments that have gone through like some, regulatory procedures with us. Um, I get where they're coming from. They look at it and think, okay, sulfur dioxide, as the most commonly proposed aerosol to use, has downsides. It could impact the ozone layer. It's a pollutant and has harmful health effects. Maybe we can come up with something better. I get that. I'm an engineer too. And then you look at the state of philanthropic funding, which I was just talking about previously, and you say, well, okay, yeah, there's not enough funding coming out. So maybe venture capital is an appropriate form. And then you do that, but then you have to find a way to return capital to your investors. And so then you start thinking about intellectual property. And so when you've got IP on a particle that could be deployed in a way that is non-excludable and non-rivalrous, as you were describing, Robert, like that, I take issue with that. Like that does not that is not, I think, an appropriate way to do this. And I have an article coming out next week that'll go into a lot more detail on my thoughts on this. But I do think that the institutions that are leading on governance and research need to continue leading when it comes to planetary stabilization interventions and that kind of thing.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
I've got one other question which I'd really like to ask. I don't know how much time we've got, but let me just get this out because I think it's critical. You've spoken, and I think we all agree here, that about the need to add SRM in some form or forms into the policy mix. But you're obviously aware, as we all are, that SRM has a long way to go before it can start delivering any serious cooling.
Yeah.
Now, what do you consider to be the risk, the danger that SRM will suffer the same fate as emissions reductions and greenhouse gas removals and become stuck in the quagmire of international negotiations while the warming continues its inexorable increase? If that's a concern, should we start thinking now about promoting disaster preparedness on the basis that we're increasingly unlikely to stave off one or more of these phase shifting tipping points you referred to earlier? For example,
Mhm.
should the prospect of the AMOC stopping at some point, as some are increasingly predicting, more frequently predicting is going to happen actually quite soon,
Yeah.
seriously soon, and maybe that in Northern Europe we should start thinking now about preparing for these long
Yeah.
Siberian winters we're going to suffer. Is that
I do
something
think
that
that's
governments should be
necessary.
thinking about now?
Yeah.
And in Southeast Asia, start planning today for the loss of massive amounts of their rice crop.
Absolutely. I do think that that is necessary because, we have to keep in mind, we don't even know if SAI is going to, like, we know that SAI will bring the temperature down, but we don't know what else it will do. And the only way that we can find out is by doing a scale up in experimentation. So we should not bet the house on getting a successful SAI deployment with zero negative consequences. We do need to start preparing for what else we can do. I'm very intrigued by research into ice sheet preservation. So there's a nonprofit called the Arret Glacier Initiative that is leading the way on research for there. I've been speaking with startups actually that are working in the realm of weather modification and breaking up heat domes over cities, trying to mitigate the size of superstorms as they develop over an increasingly warmer ocean. We're going to have to do that. I think that that is inevitable to me. And I think it's necessary. And I do think that that's actually an area where there's much more of a role for the private sector to play in terms of preparing and developing technologies, because there are a lot more obvious customers, I think, for that than there are necessarily when it comes to SAI. So yes, this is why I'm talking about this in terms of stabilization and not just cooling interventions. Like stabilization means this like larger scope of like we have to be prepared that the relatively linear change that we have experienced up until now is going to become much more volatile and non-linear. And that's just unfortunately the way it's going to be.
Right. I know guys want to hang back. I'm going to make one very short comment. You've made several references to no one being harmed as a consequence of these interventions. If that's a criterion, nothing's ever going to happen.
Oh, I get that. There has to be a definition of like what trade-offs are we willing to accept. It's like the same thing around the safest speed limit for cars to drive at to reduce like traffic deaths to zero is 0 miles per hour. So we are as a society okay with a certain amount of traffic deaths. Where is that level? That has to be determined through public policy.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Paul. I do want to get to some questions from the audience. I have a question from Jonathan. Are you aware of the conversion factor between the cooling power of square meters of sky-facing reflective material versus tons of CO2 removal? An approximation is that 10 square meters of reflective material facing the sky for 1 year creates as much cooling effect as removing 1 ton of carbon dioxide from the air.
Hmm.
There are billions of square meters of usable space above farming lands that can support reflective materials, with many side benefits for crop yields and water savings. If the cost for the 1 ton of equivalent carbon dioxide removal cooling using reflective material was under $20, can you imagine a market where cooling credits can be traded based on reflective cooling?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I've heard a form of this question many times actually, and unfortunately, I just don't think that there is a market for that. It is very, very difficult to sell even like I was just describing the most robust carbon removal credits. There is zero interest from companies or businesses to pay for something like a cooling credit when it becomes even more abstracted away like that. I don't think that a voluntary carbon market is the most appropriate way to finance that kind of thing. And I think that financing is ultimately the question that is going to come about in all these different aspects of adaptation and carbon removal. The question is who pays for this? Because if we had ways to just automatically and easily pay for it, we could solve most of the challenges. Of course, there are like other policy related things, permitting and siting and all of that. But who pays for this is the ultimate question. And my experience in the voluntary carbon market is that trying to pursue a path of selling cooling credits as a way to finance it is a non-starter, and I very much doubt that that's going to be successful for all the reasons that I was describing earlier about the incentive structures that exist within the companies and what it is that they're paying for.
Jonathan had a follow-up question.
Okay.
He asked the effects of cooling from increasing albedo reflection by any method start immediately upon deployment, and the energy sent out to space never returns, which is the equivalent of a CO2 sequestration time span of infinity years. Any cooling method of storing CO2 risks reemergence of the CO2, whereas albedo increase through reflection removes the energy for all time.
Hmm. I mean, I think that these things can be scientifically accurate, but that's just uh, it's not how the people who would make decisions about what they finance and what they pay for, that's just not how they think about it, unfortunately. So if you were zoomed out and you were playing like a video game or some sort of simulation where you're thinking about like what is the most effective way to deploy resources for managing this energy imbalance, like yeah, sure, that's valid, but the way that our institutions are set up and enterprises work, unfortunately, I just don't think that it's going to function in that way. It's sort of like a comparison I can make is to like if you want to preserve like natural forest land, you could go the route of um, paying for like carbon credits for preserving forests, but then you introduce like a lot of complexity around how you measure that, how you avoid leakage, which is like you preserve one area of forest, but then just cut down a different area of forest that no one's looking at, versus a conservation approach, where you have a conservancy set up and you've got funding that is coming in, maybe from philanthropic sources or public money, that is just there to finance paying for the protection of that land. Those are two different approaches, and I think the latter one works a lot more effectively. A similar sort of, I would think about this somewhat similarly. I don't think that a like a carbon crediting or a cooling crediting scheme is going to be an effective way to deploy large scale reflection.
I have another question, please, from someone in the audience. What are the world's leading institutions focusing on planetary interventions? For example, what about the World Meteorological Association?
They're not doing anything. I can tell you that much. I have an article that I wrote about this. I'll put in the chat right here. Um, uh, Trying to kind of catalog like who's working on this. It's all small organizations, and for a lot of the reasons that I was describing, like at the institutional level, like there is an ideology around mitigation only being the main sort of response. So you're not going to find anyone working in like bureaucracies like an international UN level organization that's really like leading on this. The lead for this is going to come from organizations like Reflective or the Center for Future Generations or the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering or the Degrees Initiative or so on. Like the number of people who are leading in this space is like vanishingly small. I've been to multiple conferences and events where I've met basically everyone. When you're thinking about just the leaders of these organizations, you're talking about like fewer than 100 people. So it's vanishingly small. And that again goes back to what I was describing, like from an ecosystem perspective, like this is a small ecosystem and it needs to grow. And right now it's limited and constrained by the amount of capital that can come in, and the capital is constrained by the Overton window of what is accessible. So to me, that is the highest leverage point to get this going. There have been other efforts at the large international level to get discussions going. And the next, I am sort of happy that the next IPCC assessment report will include a chapter on sunlight reflection and geoengineering. And many of the authors are like the people that you would want to see in the space who are they're not just opposition advocates. So it's small, but that's just how this sort of ecosystem development has to go.
Thank you. I have one last question from Doug, and it has to do with back to governance, and how we involve Indigenous communities and look
Mhm.
at free and prior informed consent as we look at some of these stability measures.
Um, yeah, part of me wants to say that question's above my pay grade. So there are, I just mentioned the Center for Future Generations, the Degrees Initiative, and the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. All of them are focused on and interested in this governance problem. How do you make decisions about this sort of thing? Like we don't have institutional structures for it. Even the UNFCCC isn't really the right forum for discussing this or making decisions. And when you think about like how to incorporate opinions and voices of people all across the global South, different indigenous communities and stuff, like we don't have a politics for that. It's we have to invent it for this. And there's a lot of interesting work going on. I'm not as expert in that, and I defer to them. But those are the three organizations who are doing work on that today that I would point you to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert, Chris, and Robert Tulip for your questions. Thank you so much, Paul, for coming to MEERTalk today. And thank you for your courage and wisdom in pivoting when you saw, carbon dioxide removal not going the way you thought about, and now pivoting to cooling. And I think that few people make a big turn like that in their careers. And so thank you for sharing your journey there.
Thank you.
I would like to just thank everyone for coming today. At MEER, we are working to help educate the public while also developing technologies to help curb the warming on our planet. We invite you to keep learning about Earth's energy imbalance and climate science on our website, and we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter where we share updates from our ongoing field and research. Our recent January newsletter highlights that MEER is launching a large-scale social and health study focused on the impacts of extreme heat and the urban heat island effect in dense urban communities in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Working with a substantial cohort of residents in Freetown, the study will examine how chronic heat exposure affects health, well-being, and daily life, and how these impacts can be reduced through the cooling interventions MEER is implementing on the ground. This work represents an important step in linking physical cooling solutions directly to measurable social and health outcomes. Here at MEER, we're primarily a volunteer staff, so please consider making a monthly donation of any amount if you've enjoyed being here or watching our MEER Talks on our YouTube channel. Also, please check us out on social media. If you have found being here beneficial today, please tell someone about MEER Talk. We hope to see you all again for our Friday 6th MEER Talk when Luke Kemp will present. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you again, Paul.